First half of class, we basically dealt with the idea of race as it is discredited or undermined by the modern evolutionary synthesis. And so in this second part of class, I want to deal with kind of some of the developments, especially since around 2003 with the sequencing of the human genome and how people are starting to think about ways in which our social ideas of race influence our biology. So in some ways, putting together some pieces that we spent a long time trying to think of as very separate. I think people in today's world have realized that separation, we needed to kind of think more about it. As I said before, this stuff is complicated to us because we live in a world in which our senses are trained. Our sensory experience tells us that people come in racial classifications. And so if I say that those are not biologically valid, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't accord with what our senses are telling us. And so it's kind of like when scientists tell us that the Earth is rotating around the sun, but all of our senses tell us that the sun is moving and that the Earth is perfectly still. It takes a long time to get that notion into our heads, and we don't. It's only because we have to repeat it in school so many times that we actually believe it. There's nothing from our sensory experience that tells us the Earth is going around the sun. We just know that because somebody taught it to us in a textbook. And so it's a similar thing with race in the sense that our senses, we're trained to see things in a certain way, but the science tells us something different than that. For a long time, the science of this seemed completely, completely recorded or completely true. And this occurred early on in anthropology. We talked about Franz Boas challenging the idea of racial classification. And then a later anthropologist named Frank Livingstone wrote in 1964 that there are no races, there are only clines, which is basically what we're talking about. What he was saying is that yes, human biological variation is true. It's not that there aren't clines. There are clines, but most biological variation occurs gradually along a range. And so to try and separate those clines or gradual variation into races doesn't make sense. A kind of very famous quote. And as we were just talking about in terms of the evolutionary synthesis, different traits, even if they didn't vary gradually, could differently combine. So different hair colors and different skin forms and different body builds could combine differently because we don't inherit things as a package from our ancestors. And this actually also goes back to something we learned early on about Darwin himself and the idea of what is a species. If you remember, one of the ideas from the great chain of being is that all species are fixed or essential, and they have these fixed characteristics for all time. And what Darwin and Wallace's idea did was to turn that idea on its head and to tell us that variation and diversity were essential to evolution and were part of being a biological species, so that species were changing over time. And then these perspectives kind of came together genetically with the work of Richard Lewontin, a very famous article written in 1972 called The Apportionment of Human Diversity. And this was when the genetic stuff was still, they were kind of revving it up. It wasn't at the stage that it is today, but they were starting to do those kinds of things where they'd say compare different human genomes. And what he figured out, he and his colleagues figured out genetically, is that all the diversity that they were measuring genetically and other ways, that there was more diversity within any so-called race than there was between a so-called race. And this doesn't just apply to genetics. When you think about height, for example, that you see people of all kinds of ranges of heights in a typical or a traditional race. And so if we look at almost any characteristic, you see that people within the category vary more between themselves than people across the category. And so this is a very famous argument. And for a long time, I would say up until the year 2000, the science on this seemed so secure that we could confidently say, hey, this is the science. It's just like the Earth goes around the sun. It's not what you see or perceive out there, but the science is clear. Since the sequencing of the human genome, since 2003, a lot of people have said, wait a second, this human genome stuff gives us a more defined look at race. Can you really say that race is just all societies? Can you really say that race is simply a social construction? And so in some ways, the landscape has changed somewhat. And this is what Levin and Schultz refer to as the molecularization of race. And we see it in things like those ancestry tests where you can, we usually are swabbing our noses now, but you can swab your mouth and send it off and they'll tell you that you're 23% this and 17% that. And what this is again, it doesn't, in Levin and Schultz, they're arguing that this actually doesn't necessarily resurrect the idea of traditional race, because the results you get back show us that we all have different ancestries from different parts of the world, and that in some ways, what we see is not necessarily one type. There's been a lot of debate about this. For one thing, it's based on a sample of populations in these contemporary populations in these areas. The sample is incomplete. And if you think about how many ancestors you would have going back 1,000 years, which is not even that long. If you think about human generations and that you have two parents and each of those have to have two parents, and so it's 2 to the power of 20 or 25, you find out that the number of your possible ancestors gets really, really large, the number of generations that you go back. So when we get these tests back, it's not that they don't say anything, but for the most part, they are trying to estimate a percentage of something that is based on a sample, an incomplete sample of the human population. So that's one thing that's happened. The other thing that has happened is that certain medicines, and in Levin and Schultz, they talk about a heart drug that was targeted for African-American populations. Again, there's been a lot of debate about this because in some ways people do want medications that are tailored for the issues that people experience as a member of a certain population. On the other hand, sometimes the profit motive and the marketing motive is not equal to the scientific categorization. And so I think what also happens is a lot of these medicines were marketed at a time when a genetic screening was very expensive. And so we use self-identified race as a proxy for a more complete genetic scanning. Now that those things are less expensive, we can get more targeted medications that deal with our actual risk factors rather than just trying to lump them together into these larger categories. The other thing that I think has happened, and you may have seen this, is that if you look at television sometimes, you'll have this forensic anthropologist and they'll come out with a bone and they'll be like, well, whose bone is this? And they'll say, they'll do some fancy schmancy measurements and they'll tell you that it's a white man. And you're like, well, wait a second. I learned in my anthropology class that, you couldn't do that. And here's this person waving a bone around and saying that they have a suspect. So how does that work? How does forensic anthropology work? And some of you may have taken a forensic osteology class, maybe even over there. And so you're sometimes asked to make race assignments. So how does that work? And you're not the only one who might ask this question. In fact, there was a forensic anthropologist who published an article in 1992 and said, hey, if races don't exist, then why can forensic anthropologists seemingly identify them so well? What are they doing? Now, this is actually a really interesting question. I want to deal with a little bit because it is something that we anthropologists do, and you might even do it over there in that lab someday. It's a great thing to do. So what are the forensic anthropologists good at, or what are they measuring? What forensic anthropology does is they measure, obviously, the remains, whatever they can. Let's just deal with bones here. And what they do is they match them against a database of existing populations and historical populations in order to give you a probability of the ancestry of those, of whatever remains you're dealing with. And so what happens in forensic anthropology is that it depends upon their estimate of what race classification would be, depends upon the context in which the bones are found. So there's a super interesting article. It's a bit, I would assign it, but it's really difficult reading. And what these forensic anthropologists did is they were sent these bones that were found in a creek in Iowa, off in the middle of the country. And so they took them into the lab and they said, okay, let's just take these bones and we'll blast them out against the database of world populations that we have and see what we would estimate where they were from. And when they did that, they said, well, according to our best match, these bones would be someone from Easter Island. Now, Easter Island is a small population of people off the coast of Chile. So to say that the bones found in Iowa belong to somebody in Easter Island would be a huge stretch. So they said, okay, let's look at them in the context of what we know about the Iowa population and then rerun the numbers. And they said, if we did that, then we would say that this person probably identified as white based on their probable European ancestry. But then they went a little bit further and they said, well, what if we had found these bones in Gary, Indiana? Now, I don't know if many of you have been through Gary, Indiana recently, but it's kind of the opposite of the population of Iowa. And so they said, well, if we looked at it in that, we would guess then that these bones belong to a Black man. And then they said, well, what if we had found them in Hawaii? And they said, well, if we had found them in Hawaii, we would tell you that this was probably a native Pacific Islander, which kind of makes sense because that was the original thing when they just blasted it against the world database. So what are forensic anthropologists doing? Sometimes on TV, we don't see this intermediate step, which is that they estimate the ancestry and then based on the ancestry, take a probability guess at what kind of race that person would identify with based on the population in which they live. What you cannot tell from bones is what a person's skin color will be, or what these things that we usually look at when we talk about race and ethnicity that we talked about, like eye form and nose form and all those things. Those are difficult to actually directly, in the case of skin color, impossible to directly deduce from the bone formation. So it is, yes, they've become very sophisticated at identifying ancestry and where bones and other remains probably fit in. And given that we know how people tend to classify people of certain ancestries, we can then say, aha, this person, you're looking for a white man, go for it. Because It's based on the probability of what occurs in the population. So, like I said, we have used in some ways this information to re-examine some of the associations between race, biology, and culture. So again, it's important to understand humans do vary biologically, and those variations can have health effects, whether you're lactose tolerant, malaria resistant, or different kinds of genetic stuff going on, genetic risk factors. And they can even influence something that different ways of talking about intelligence and the measurements of those, those definitely have a genetic or a biological influence. And so when we talk about race, and here John Rutherford, we saw him back in the mostly out of Africa idea. He actually comes up with some good phrases and ideas about things. What Rutherford wants us to think about race is that it's a culturally constructed label. So it is something that comes to us from our society that crudely and imprecisely describes real variation. So there's real variation out there, and race is a way that we try to kind of do a first cut at it or a crude description of it. But it's not our best bet if we really want to understand biological categories and biological difference. But one of the crucial things here is that once you start to label populations and you start to make laws and you start to make people to have social expectations of what they will be like, and you start to make ideas about what kind of jobs they should have and what kind of hospitals they can go to and how you're going to treat them, then that label, even if it is a cultural construct or an idea, is also a real thing socially. If I make a law, it might be a completely arbitrary law, but it's going to affect you. And it then may influence your access to education, your access to healthcare, your access to wealth, your access to the political system. And so these social labels have greater effects than simply biological ancestry. The biological ancestry may be important and it's good to know about, but how you will be socially classified based on that ancestry has traditionally been more important than the ancestry itself. And on page 159, at the end of that section on intelligence and the IQ test, they talk about the fact that yes, our IQ tests often in some ways sort out so that certain populations seem to have a racial component. But on page 159, they say that many studies have shown that how an individual will do on an IQ test is more accurately predicted by social class and educational background than by race. So if I know how much wealth you have and what your education is, that's a better predictor of how you're going to score on an IQ test, and certainly the SAT and the ACT, than your race. When African American and European Americans are matched in terms of these factors, social class and education, the differences in average IQ scores disappear. So if you compare people across the wealth line, if you compare people of similar wealth and similar educational backgrounds, then a lot of these differences that we get so excited about basically go away. And so that is to say that when we're doing things like trying to figure out how smart people are, that often has much more to do with their social class and where they grew up than it does with their, what we might call their native intelligence. And so this has led to something that in anthropology, we've seen this before, but is called a more biocultural approach. So in anthropology, we spent a decent amount of time trying to tell people, and it's important to understand that your biology or your race does not determine your culture. But there's a different side to this, which is that the things that we do socially, how much money you have, for example, has an impact on how you're going to be treated in the healthcare system. And so money is not something that is biological, but it certainly has a huge biological effect. If I want to get good care, it helps me out, even though it's a completely social institution. So are ways in which we've made laws and classified people and made people go into different places definitely have an impact on our life expectancy, what kinds of things we're going to be able to do in our life. And so especially with human beings, we have something which Lavin and Schultz call phenotypic plasticity, which is to say that the same person born in a different and raised in a different environment changes based on the food they have and the stuff that's in the water, and if you're drinking out of lead pipes or not. That changes your biology. And so especially as you're growing up in these areas, if you're growing up in an area in which there is high poverty and you're marginalized politically from the mainstream, it's probably going to have an effect not just on you socially, but on your biological development. And so an anthropologist named Clarence Gravely talks about here that the social classification of race actually does have a biological effect on people, because this social inequality becomes embodied as people are growing up. And so it gets in some ways passed along and influences the biological development of people who grow up in different racial categories. And so this is from one of Gravely's articles, which he adapted from another anthropologist, which is basically a kind of way to say that when we classify people in terms of race, add on to that racism that makes it so that certain people are unable to access education, healthcare, or wealth, then that can have a biological effect. So when we think about things like infant mortality and differential rates of infant mortality across race, that's not because of a person's genetics or biology, but it has a lot to do with the way in which the education, healthcare system work and who's inhabiting those systems. And so they have this kind of nice circle here where you have fetal health, and you have different rates of birth weights and the maternal health that influences that. It goes into childhood and then can come out later in such issues as stress and hypertension and diabetes. And this is not given to us, and this is not fixed in our genetic code, but it can differentially manifest itself based on your socioeconomic status. And I would say that this happens to people everywhere of any race who are raised in marginal and impoverished conditions. These kinds of things can happen. And so again, this is not to say that this is not fixed for all time. Once we understand that this is going on, it makes it possible to intervene in different ways so that people don't have to necessarily grow up with the same levels of child poverty. And we know that it's so important to influence those things growing up so that people don't develop problems later on in life that will then get passed into the next generation. And so Lavin and Schultz end this chapter with this kind of pretty lofty subtitle here: can we predict the future of human evolution? Probably the answer to that is no, but I'll change the question a little bit. Given this information, how does it influence what we should do in our lives and how we should live? And on page 164 through 166, Lavin and Schultz go through some of the different models that people have had to talk about human evolution, human behavior. And as we've talked about before, they're particularly, they see niche construction, or how organisms modify their environment and then change the selective pressures, as a particularly promising perspective, because it tells us something about biological evolution, but it also, as they say here, is very much like what anthropology has been saying all along, a view many anthropologists and others have held for a very long time. And so they talk here about body temperatures, for example, and they say that human body temperatures are pretty flexible and plastic, but they depend a lot on your access to heat and your access to who owns the furnace and who's going to be able to turn that on and whether you're going to have power through the winter. And so our body temperature actually has a lot to do with our society, our place in society, and our social and economic conditions. And so niche construction from a biological perspective is also something that we see how we can think about culture as having a huge effect on human life, because we're very good at constructing niches, but also has an effect biologically as well. And so what Levin and Schultz are saying here is that they say that nature offers us mixed messages. Basically, they're saying there isn't one natural way to live. There isn't one thing that is given in nature that tells us, aha, that is the natural way to live. And what they're arguing against here are a couple different perspectives. So they have a whole page of different perspectives here. And I don't want to get into the terminology too much, because you might look at the word sociobiology or evolutionary psychology and think, aha, that sounds good, sociobiology. And they are actually arguing against these perspectives because the people who call themselves or who have been associated with both sociobiology and evolutionary psychology have often been the ones that have told us that there is only one way, that humans are sort of destined to live in one way because of their natural heritage. And so what they're trying to say here, I'm glad that we got some interesting thoughts at the end of the chapter here, is that human life is more than simply physical survival. We as humans are seeking to create lives that are meaningful. We don't want to live lives that aren't meaningful. And so when we think about how we create a meaningful life, we find out that humans are quite capable of change, of changing their lives, of changing the conditions in which they live. And as we look cross-culturally at different groups and historically at different groups, we're also capable of living in a vast array of different social and cultural systems. And so one of you wanted to know, well, how can we address these racial inequalities or the racism that is in our society? And what I hope we can learn from anthropology is that if we can identify that these things are not necessary, that they're not genetic, that they don't have to be, if we can figure out what's going on, if we can figure out what is causing the bad maternal health outcomes, then it becomes possible to intervene, to figure out, oh, wait a second, we're not destined to have a differential of infant mortality based on race. That doesn't have to be. We can change that. There are ways to change that. And so humans are wonderful at constructing different climates and niches and turning on the air conditioning and trading things around. And we can also take that ingenuity and use it to think about different ways in which we can configure our society. And if we don't like things that we see, one of the lessons is, hey, we know where those ideas and where those inequalities came from, and it's not going to be easy. I'm not going to wave any magic wands, but you can do something if we have the will as a society to change that. So that's our fifth chapter, which is our first chapter of this unit. On Thursday in the next class, we'll go much more heavily into archaeological methods and do some archaeology. And then as this unit progresses, we'll be we'll be revisiting some of these things as we talk about the concept of culture and how that becomes the idea of explanation in anthropology. So, thanks, folks.